The bitter wind of January 1905 carried the scent of coal smoke through the narrow streets of Millfield, Pennsylvania, a small coal mining town nestled in the Appalachian foothills. Snow piled in dirty heaps against the worn, clapboard houses, and the skeletal trees stood like silent sentinels against the gray sky. The Blackwood family home sat at the edge of town, a once grand Victorian now fallen into disrepair, its peeling paint and sagging porch a testament to the family's declining fortunes. Inside, 13-year-old Elijah Blackwood huddled near the kitchen stove, his thin frame wrapped in a threadbare sweater as he tried to escape the perpetual chill that seemed to permeate the house. His father, Thomas Blackwood, had left for the mines before dawn, and his mother lay bedridden upstairs, consumed by consumption that rattled her lungs and painted her handkerchiefs with blood. Elijah called a soft voice from the parlor. "Could you bring me some tea, dear?" It was his Aunt Meredith, his father's younger sister, who had come to live with them after her husband died in a mining accident the previous spring. At 25, she was still young and beautiful, with raven hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. She had arrived with nothing but a small trunk of belongings and a shadow behind her eyes that Elijah couldn't quite understand. "Yes, Aunt Meredith," he replied, placing the kettle on the stove. As he waited for the water to boil, Elijah's gaze drifted to the small photograph on the mantel, a family portrait taken before his mother's illness. Before Aunt Meredith arrived, before everything changed. He barely recognized himself in that smiling boy. The kettle's whistle broke his reverie. He prepared the tea just as his aunt liked it, with honey and a splash of milk, and carried it carefully to the parlor. Meredith sat in the window seat, her slender fingers working a piece of embroidery, her face half hidden in shadow. "Thank you, Elijah," she said, her fingers brushing his as she took the cup. "You're such a good boy." Something in her tone made him pause. The way she looked at him lately had changed, her gaze lingering a moment too long, her smiles holding secrets he couldn't decipher. "Your father won't be home until late," she said, setting aside her embroidery. "And your mother is sleeping. Come sit with me a while." Elijah hesitated, feeling a strange tightness in his chest. "I should check on Mother first." "She's resting," Meredith said, her voice firmer now. "The doctor gave her laudanum. She won't wake for hours." As Elijah sat beside his aunt, the parlor seemed to grow smaller, the air thicker. Outside, the early winter darkness descended, and shadows danced across the walls as the fire flickered in the grate. "You're becoming a man now," Meredith whispered, her hand finding his knee. "You look so much like your father did at your age." The clock on the mantel ticked loudly in the silence that followed, each second stretching into eternity, as Elijah felt the weight of something unspoken hanging between them, something that made his skin crawl and his heart race with inexplicable dread. February brought no relief from winter's grip. The snow piled higher and the wind howled through the cracks in the Blackwood house like a wounded animal. Elijah's mother worsened, her coughing fits growing more violent, her frail body sinking deeper into the mattress with each passing day. Thomas Blackwood spent more time at the mines or the tavern, leaving Elijah alone with his aunt and his dying mother. The boy tried to stay busy with chores and schoolwork, but increasingly found himself trapped in Meredith's orbit, unable to escape her attention. "I've drawn you a bath," she said one evening, appearing in his doorway as he sat reading by lamplight. "The water will get cold." Elijah closed his book, discomfort crawling up his spine. At 13, he had bathed himself for years, but lately, Meredith insisted on helping him, claiming his mother had asked her to ensure he was properly cleaned. "I can manage myself, Aunt Meredith," he said quietly. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Don't be ridiculous. Your mother would be upset if she knew you were refusing my help." The mention of his mother silenced any further protest. Reluctantly, he followed her to the bathroom, where steam rose from the copper tub in ghostly tendrils. The small room felt claustrophobic with both of them inside, the single gas lamp casting long shadows across the tiled floor. "I'll wait outside," Elijah said, his voice cracking. Meredith's hand closed around his wrists, her nails digging into his skin. "You're not a child anymore, Elijah. There's no need for modesty between us." Later that night, as Elijah lay sleepless in his bed, he heard his father and aunt arguing downstairs, their voices rising and falling like the winter wind. He couldn't make out the words, but the tension in their voices was unmistakable. Then came the sound of a slap, followed by silence, then quiet sobbing. The next morning, his father left before dawn as usual, but not before stopping at Elijah's bedroom door. "You're the man of the house when I'm gone," Thomas said, his eyes bloodshot, his breath sour with whiskey. "Take care of your mother." And double quotes. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Be careful around your aunt. She's not been right since Herbert died." Before Elijah could ask what he meant, his father was gone, the front door slamming behind him, leaving the boy with a sense of foreboding that settled in his stomach like a stone. That afternoon, while Elijah sat reading to his mother, her thin hand clutching his, Meredith appeared in the doorway, watching them with an expression that made his words falter. "Elijah," his mother whispered, her voice barely audible. "Promise me something." "Anything, Mother. If anything happens to me." She glanced toward the doorway where Meredith stood. "Go to Reverend Collins, tell him everything." "What do you mean?" Elijah asked, confusion and fear mingling in his chest. But his mother had drifted back to sleep, her breathing shallow, her secrets locked away behind pale lips. March arrived with thawing snow and mud that sucked at boots and wagon wheels. The world outside began to awaken from winter's sleep, but inside the Blackwood house a different kind of darkness grew. Elijah's mother died on the 15th of March, her body finally surrendering to the disease that had consumed her for months. The funeral was smaller, a few neighbors, Reverend Collins, and the family standing around a simple pine coffin as it was lowered into the muddy earth of the cemetery behind the church. Thomas Blackwood stood stoic and silent, his face a mask of grief or resignation. Elijah couldn't tell which. Meredith wept openly, her black veil hiding her face, her gloved hand gripping Elijah's shoulder with uncomfortable pressure. "Your mother is with God now," Reverend Collins told Elijah after the service, his kind eyes searching the boy's face. "If you ever need to talk, my door is always open to you." Elijah remembered his mother's words. Go to Reverend Collins. Tell him everything, but what was everything? What could he possibly tell the Reverend that would matter now? Life in the Blackwood house changed after the funeral. Thomas withdrew further, spending less time at home, his grief finding solace in the bottom of a whiskey bottle. Meredith took over running the household, her position shifting from guest to mistress of the house with unsettling ease. One evening in late March, as Elijah sat at the kitchen table completing his arithmetic homework, Meredith placed a glass of milk before him. "Drink up," she said, watching him intently. "You're still growing." The milk tasted slightly bitter, but Elijah drank it to avoid an argument. Within half an hour, a strange lethargy overtook him, his limbs growing heavy, his thoughts clouding. He barely made it to his bedroom before collapsing onto his bed, the world spinning around him. He woke the next morning with fragmented memories of the night before, dreams, or perhaps not dreams, of his aunt's face hovering above his, her hands on his skin, her whispered words making no sense in his confused state. "You slept deeply," Meredith remarked at breakfast, buttering a piece of toast with precise movements. "No nightmares about your poor mother?" Elijah shook his head, unable to meet her gaze, a feeling of shame washing over him, though he couldn't articulate why. The pattern continued through April, the bitter milk, the disorienting nights, the fragmented memories, and the growing sense that something terrible was happening that he couldn't fully comprehend or stop. One Sunday after church, Elijah lingered behind as his father and aunt walked ahead toward home. With shaking hands, he approached Reverend Collins, who was closing up the church. "Reverend," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "my mother told me to come to you. To tell you everything." The Reverend's kind face grew serious. "What is it, son? What do you need to tell me?" But as Elijah opened his mouth to speak, he realized he didn't know what to say. How could he explain what he himself didn't understand? The strange behavior of his aunt? The bitter milk? The disorienting nights? The shame that clung to him like a second skin? Ball quotes, he faltered, tears stinging his eyes. "I don't know. I just don't feel safe anymore." May brought warmer days and longer evenings, the sun hanging in the sky until nearly 8 o'clock. The town of Millfield emerged from winter's grip, gardens bloomed, and children played in the streets until their mothers called them home for supper. But for Elijah, spring brought no relief. The Blackwood house had become a prison, its walls holding secrets that pressed against his consciousness like a physical weight. His father had taken to sleeping at the mining company boarding house more often than not, claiming early shifts as his excuse, though Elijah suspected it was to escape the oppressive atmosphere of their home. One evening, as Elijah washed dishes after supper, he overheard his aunt speaking in hushed tones to Mrs. Caldwell, the neighbor who occasionally helped with household chores. "It's a blessing, really," Meredith was saying, her voice low but triumphant. "After losing Herbert, I never thought I'd have the chance to be a mother. The Lord works in mysterious ways," Mrs. Caldwell replied. "When is the baby due?" "November, the doctor thinks." Just before Thanksgiving, the plate Elijah was drying slipped from his hands, shattering on the kitchen floor. The conversation in the parlor stopped abruptly. "Elijah," Meredith called. "Are you all right?" His heart hammering against his ribs, Elijah knelt to pick up the broken pieces. "Just dropped a plate," he called back, his voice strained. A baby. Aunt Meredith was going to have a baby. The realization sat like ice in his stomach. Uncle Herbert had been dead for over a year. His father was barely home. Who, then, was the father of Meredith's child? A terrible suspicion began to form in his mind. fragments of his disorienting nights suddenly taking on new, horrifying meaning. That night, Elijah didn't drink the milk Meredith offered. Instead, he poured it into a potted plant when she wasn't looking and pretended to fall asleep. He laid in bed for hours, listening to the creaking of the old house, waiting. Just after midnight, his bedroom door opened slowly. Through narrowly slitted eyes, he watched Meredith enter, her white nightgown ghostly in the darkness. She approached his bed, sitting on the edge and reaching out to stroke his hair. "My sweet boy," she whispered, her hand moving down to his cheek, his neck, his chest. "You've given me such a precious gift. Our little secret." Elijah's stomach churned with revulsion, but he forced himself to remain still, his breathing even. After what seemed an eternity, Meredith leaned down to kiss his forehead and left the room, closing the door quietly behind her. The moment she was gone, Elijah rushed to the wash basin and retched until his stomach was empty. His tears streamed down his face as the full horror of his situation became clear. Whatever Meredith had been doing to him on those nights when his mind was clouded, those nights he could only half remember, had resulted in a pregnancy. He was going to be a father at 13 years old to his aunt's child. The perversion of it, the violation, was almost too much to bear. But underneath the horror and shame, a spark of anger ignited. This couldn't continue. He had to tell someone, had to escape. Reverend Collins. His mother's dying words echoed in his mind. Go to Reverend Collins, tell him everything. June brought stifling heat to Millfield, the air thick with humidity and coal dust. Elijah spent as much time away from home as possible, taking odd jobs around town, mowing lawns, running errands for the general store, anything to avoid being alone with Meredith. Her pregnancy was beginning to show, a slight rounding of her abdomen that she disguised with cleverly cut dresses and aprons. Thomas Blackwood seemed oblivious, or perhaps willfully blind, to the changes in his sister's appearance or the increasingly proprietary way she regarded his son. "I saw you talking to Reverend Collins after church again," Meredith remarked one Sunday afternoon as they walked home, Thomas having stayed behind to speak with a fellow miner. "What were you discussing so intently?" Clea kept his eyes on the dusty road. "Just about a Bible study for boys my age." Her fingers dug into his arm. "Don't lie to me, Elijah. I saw how seriously you were speaking. What did you tell him?" "Nothing," he said, pulling away from her grip. "I didn't tell him anything, but he had been trying to. For weeks now he had been attempting to find the courage to confide in the Reverend, to put into words the unspeakable things happening in the Blackwood house. Each time, shame and fear had silenced him at the crucial moment. That night, as he lay in bed reading by lamplight, his father appeared in the doorway, a rare occurrence these days. "May I come in?" Thomas asked, his voice rough from years of coal dust and whiskey. Elijah nodded, setting aside his book. Thomas sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the frame creaking under his weight. For a long moment he was silent, his weathered hands clasped between his knees, his gaze fixed on the worn floorboards. "Your mother was a good woman," he finally said. "That best I've ever known. I've not been much of a father to you since she passed, and for that I'm sorry." Elijah swallowed the lump in his throat. "It's all right, Father." Thomas shook his head. "No, it's not. I've left you alone too much. With ... I quote, he hesitated. "With your aunt." Something in his father's tone made Elijah look up sharply. Did he know? Did he suspect what Meredith had been doing? "Father, she's not well, Elijah," Thomas interrupted, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "After Herbert died, something broke in her. I thought bringing her here would help, that your mother's goodness might heal whatever was broken." He laughed bitterly. "Instead, I fear I've only brought her darkness into our home." Elijah's heart raced. This was his chance, perhaps his only chance, to tell his father the truth. "She's going to have a baby," he blurted out, the words tumbling from his lips before he could reconsider. Thomas went very still, his face draining of color. "What did you say? Aunt Meredith is pregnant? I heard her telling Mrs. Caldwell." His father stood abruptly, pacing the small room, his hands clenched into fists. "That's not possible. Herbert's been dead over a year." Unless ... double quotes, his eyes narrowed as he looked at Elijah. "Has she had men here? When I've been away?" Elijah shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "No, Father. Not that I've seen." "Then who?" Thomas demanded, his voice rising. "Who's the father of her child?" The words stuck in Elijah's throat, choking him. How could he tell his father that a 13-year-old boy had somehow fathered his own aunt's child? How could he explain what Meredith had done to him when he himself didn't fully understand it? "I don't know," he whispered, the lie bitter on his tongue. Thomas stared at his son for a long moment, something like suspicion flickering in his eyes, before he turned and left the room without another word. July scorched Millfield with unrelenting heat. The creek that ran through town slowed to a trickle, and dust coated everything: windowsills, porch railings the leaves of struggling garden plants. Inside the Blackwood house, a different kind of heat simmered. The tension between Thomas and Meredith had become palpable, manifesting in terse exchanges at meals and long, accusatory silences. Elijah caught his father watching Meredith when she wasn't looking, his eyes tracking the growing swell of her stomach with a mixture of confusion and mounting anger. For her part, Meredith seemed unconcerned by Thomas's scrutiny, moving through the house with an almost serene confidence, as if she held all the power. "We need to talk about your condition," Thomas finally said one evening as they sat at the dinner table, the words falling into the silence like stones. Meredith dabbed at her lips with a napkin, unruffled. "My condition? You mean my pregnancy?" "Yes, I suppose we should discuss it. I'll need a proper layette for the baby. And the spare room should be converted to a nursery." Thomas slammed his hand on the table, making the dishes jump. "Don't play games with me, Meredith. You know what I'm asking. Who is the father?" She smiled, a cold, triumphant smile that sent a chill down Elijah's spine despite the summer heat. "Why, Thomas, I'm surprised at you. The father's right here at this table." Elijah felt his blood turn to ice. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move, could only watch in horror as his father's face contorted with rage. "You lying whore," Thomas hissed, rising from his chair. "I never touched you. Never." Meredith's smile didn't waver. "I didn't say it was you, brother dear." Both adults turned to look at Elijah, who sat frozen in his chair, his face drained of color. Thomas's expression shifted from rage to confusion, then to a dawning horror that aged him 10 years in an instant. "Elijah?" he whispered, his voice breaking on the name. "What is she saying?" "He's such a special boy," Meredith said, her voice dreamy now, her hand resting protectively over her rounded abdomen. "So like you were at his age, Thomas. So innocent. So trusting." "She's lying," Elijah managed to say, his voice thin and reedy in his own ears. "Father, she's been putting something in my milk. At night she's silence." Meredith shrieked, her serene mask slipping. "Don't you dare speak such filth. Thomas, can't you see he's trying to come between us? Between me and my baby?" Thomas stood rigid, his face ashen, his gaze moving between his son and his sister as if trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he could bear to believe. "Get out," he finally said, his voice flat. Meredith blinked, confused. "What? Get out of my house. Now, before I forget, you're my blood." She laughed, a high, unhinged sound that raised the hair on Elijah's arms. "You can't be serious. Where would I go? With a child on the way? Your nephew or niece, Thomas?" "Not my nephew," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "My grandchild. God help us all." The truth hung in the air between them, terrible and irrefutable. Meredith's smile faltered, then returned, sharper than before. "Yes," she said softly. "Your grandchild. A new Blackwood. And if you turn me out, I'll tell everyone in town what happened under your roof. How you failed to protect your son from me." She looked at Elijah, her eyes glittering with malice. "How the boy came to me willingly, night after night." Thomas's hand moved faster than Elijah had ever seen, striking Meredith across the face with enough force to knock her from her chair. She crumpled to the floor, her hand flying to her reddened cheek, her eyes wide with shock. "Father, no," Elijah cried, leaping from his chair, though whether to protect his aunt or his father he wasn't sure. Thomas stood over Meredith, his chest heaving, his face twisted with a grief and rage so profound that Elijah barely recognized him. "You will leave this house tonight," he said, each word deliberate and final. "You will never speak of this to anyone, and you will never, ever come near my son again." August brought thunderstorms that rattled windows and sent lightning arcing across the night sky. The violence of the weather matched the turmoil within the Blackwood house, where nothing had been the same since that terrible night in July. Meredith had not left as Thomas demanded. Instead, she had locked herself in her bedroom for 3 days, emerging hollow-eyed but resolute, her bruised cheek a silent accusation. Thomas had retreated to the mining company boarding house, returning home only for fresh clothes and tense, whispered arguments with his sister that Elijah could hear through the thin walls but couldn't quite make out. Left largely alone, Elijah existed in a state of suspended dread, waiting for some resolution that never seemed to come. He attended school mechanically, avoided the curious stares of neighbors who had begun to notice the strange dynamics in the Blackwood household, and spent long hours sitting by his mother's grave, wishing desperately that she were still alive to protect him. One stormy afternoon, as rain lashed against the windows of the empty house, Elijah finally gathered his courage and walked to the parsonage behind the church. Reverend Collins answered his knock, concern evident in his kind face as he ushered the soaking boy inside. "Elijah, my boy, you're drenched. Come sit by the fire." Mrs. Collins appeared with a towel and a mug of hot tea, clucking sympathetically over his wet clothes before tactfully withdrawing to another room. "Now," the Reverend said, settling into a chair opposite Elijah, "what brings you out in such weather?" The words Elijah had rehearsed countless times suddenly evaporated. How could he explain what had happened? The shame of it burned in his chest, threatening to consume him. "My mother told me to come to you," he finally said, his voice barely audible over the drumming of rain on the roof, "before she died. She said to tell you everything." Reverend Collins leaned forward, his face solemn. "I'm listening, son." And so, haltingly at first, then in a rush like the storm outside, Elijah told him everything about Meredith's arrival after Herbert's death, the strange attention she paid him, the bitter milk, the disorienting nights, the terrible revelation of her pregnancy, and the confrontation with his father. As he spoke, Reverend Collins's expression shifted from concern to horror to a deep, righteous anger that transformed his usually gentle features. When Elijah finally fell silent, exhausted by the telling, the Reverend rose and paced the small room, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "This cannot stand," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled fury. "What your aunt has done is an abomination in the eyes of God and man. She has violated not only the laws of nature but the sacred trust of family. What can be done?" Elijah asked, desperate for some solution, some way to escape the nightmare his life had become. The Reverend was quiet for a long moment, his expression troubled. "The law would see her punished, certainly, but the scandal would destroy your family name. You would forever be known as ... double quotes," he trailed off, unable to put into words what Elijah would be labeled. "The boy who fathered his aunt's child," Elijah finished for him, the words like ashes in his mouth. "There may be another way," Reverend Collins said slowly. "Her father's sister disappeared once before, after her husband died. She could disappear again to a home for unwed mothers, perhaps, in another state. The child could be given up for adoption, raised by a decent family who would never know its origins." "And Aunt Meredith?" The Reverend's eyes hardened. "There are institutions for women like her, places where she could never harm another child." Hope flickered in Elijah's chest for the first time in months. Could it be possible? Could this nightmare end without everyone in Millfield knowing what had happened in the Blackwood house? "I'll speak to your father tonight," Reverend Collins said, placing a comforting hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Together, we'll find a way through this darkness." As Elijah walked home through the lessening rain, a weight seemed to have lifted from his shoulders. He wasn't alone anymore. Someone else knew the truth, someone who believed him, someone who had the power to help. He was so lost in this newfound hope that he didn't notice the figure watching from the Blackwood porch until he was halfway up the walkway. Meredith stood there, her pregnant silhouette unmistakable against the lighted doorway, her face in shadow but her posture alert, tense like a predator sensing danger. "Where have you been, Elijah?" she called, her voice carrying on the damp air. "I've been worried sick." The old fear gripped him again, but this time Elijah forced himself to meet her gaze. "Just walking," he said, climbing the porch steps with deliberate calm. "Clearing my head." She reached out to touch his wet hair, but he stepped past her into the house, his heart hammering but his resolve firm. Just a few more hours, he told himself. Cuckoo. Just until Reverend Collins spoke to his father, and this would all be over. September arrived with cooler nights and the first hints of autumn color in the trees surrounding Millfield. The town prepared for its annual harvest festival, storefronts displaying decorations of corn husks and pumpkins, children rehearsing songs for the school pageant, farmers bringing their best produce to market. In the Blackwood house, a different kind of preparation was underway, following his conversation with Reverend Collins. Thomas had returned home permanently, his demeanor transformed from defeated to grimly determined. He spent long hours closeted with the Reverend and Dr. Mitchell, the town physician who had attended Elijah's mother in her final illness. Meredith, now visibly pregnant at 6 months, watched these meetings with growing suspicion, her once confident manner giving way to nervous vigilance. She no longer attempted to approach Elijah, maintaining a careful distance from the boy, but he often caught her staring at him with an expression that mingled resentment and possessiveness. One evening, as Elijah sat on the back porch steps, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and purple, his father joined him, sitting heavily on the worn wood. "Dr. Mitchell has a colleague in Philadelphia," Thomas said without preamble, his voice low, though no one else was near. "Dr. Whitaker, who runs a private sanitarium for women with nervous conditions. Reverend Collins has made arrangements for your aunt to be admitted there next week." Elijah felt a surge of relief so strong it made him dizzy. "And the baby?" Thomas's face hardened. "There's a home for unwed mothers connected to the sanitarium. She'll deliver there, and the child will be placed with a family far from here. No one will ever know its origins. The unspoken word hung between them, its incestuous origins, its conception in violation and manipulation. Elijah swallowed hard, trying to process the complex emotions swirling within him. Relief predominated, yes, but also a strange sense of loss for a child he had never wanted, never asked for, but who carried his blood nonetheless. "Does Aunt Meredith know?" he asked. Thomas shook his head. "Not yet, Doctor. Mitchell will tell her tomorrow that he's concerned about complications with her pregnancy and has arranged for her to see a specialist in Philadelphia. I'll accompany them as far as the sanitarium, then return alone. As far as anyone in town will know, Meredith has gone to stay with distant relatives due to her delicate condition. It seemed too simple, to need a solution to the nightmare that had consumed their lives for months." Elijah wanted desperately to believe it would work, that in a week's time Meredith would be gone, and the healing could begin. "What about after?" he asked. "Will she come back here?" His father's eyes were cold. "No, never. The doctors believe her. Condition is permanent. She remain in the sanitarium indefinitely." The finality in his father's tone told Elijah everything he needed to know. Meredith Blackwood would effectively cease to exist, locked away in an institution where her crimes against her nephew would remain secret, where she could never hurt another child. The next morning Elijah woke to the sound of raised voices from downstairs. Cautiously he crept to the top of the stairs, listening as Dr. Mitchell attempted to explain to Meredith why she needed specialized care in Philadelphia. "I don't understand why I can't be treated here," Meredith was saying, her voice tight with suspicion. "You delivered me and Thomas. Surely you can deliver my baby." "Your case is complicated, Miss Blackwood," Dr. Mitchell replied, his professional tone strained. "There are concerns about your blood pressure, about the position of the child. Dr. Whitaker has experience with cases like yours." "Cases like mine?" she repeated, her voice rising. "What exactly does that mean, doctor?" There was a pause, then Thomas's voice low and threatening. "It means you're going to Philadelphia, Meredith. Today. Pack your things." A strange laugh, high and brittle, echoed through the house. "See, you're sending me away, locking me up somewhere no one will find me, where I can have my baby in secret." Her voice dropped to a hiss. "Our baby, Elijah." Elijah froze on the stairs, his blood turning to ice as he realized she knew he was listening. "That's enough," Thomas shouted. "You'll not speak to him, not look at him. Do you understand me?" "You can't separate us forever, Thomas," Meredith said, her voice now eerily calm. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The sound of a slap cut through the air, followed by Dr. Mitchell's alarmed voice. "Thomas, control yourself. She's with child." "Get her out of my sight," Thomas growled. "Get her things packed and get her on the afternoon train before I forget she's carrying an innocent." Footsteps approached the stairs, and Elijah retreated quickly to his room, closing the door silently behind him. He sat on his bed, trembling as the house erupted into activity, doors opening and closing. Footsteps hurrying back and forth, muffled voices giving orders and arguing. By noon, a carriage waited outside the Blackwood house. Elijah watched from his bedroom window as Dr. Mitchell escorted Meredith down the front walkway, his father following with her trunk. Meredith walked stiffly, her face pale and set, her hands cradling her swollen abdomen. At the carriage door, she suddenly stopped and turned, looking up directly at Elijah's window. Even from a distance, he could feel the intensity of her gaze, the unspoken promise in her eyes. Then his father's hand closed around her arm, urging her into the carriage, and the moment was broken. As the carriage pulled away, disappearing down the tree-lined street toward the train station, Elijah felt as if he could breathe fully for the first time in months. It was over. Meredith was gone, and with her, the shadow that had darkened his life since her arrival, or so he thought. October painted the hills around Millfield in fiery hues of red and gold, the beauty of the landscape at odds with the somber mood that had settled over the Blackwood house. Though Meredith was gone, her presence lingered like a persistent ghost, felt in the silences between father and son, in the rooms she had occupied, in the memories that neither could fully escape. Thomas threw himself into his work at the mines, taking extra shifts that kept him away from home for days at a time. When he was present, he was distant, his eyes haunted, his conversation limited to practical matters. Had Elijah completed his schoolwork? Was there enough firewood for the coming winter? Did they need supplies from town? They never spoke of Meredith, or of the child that would be born in November. It was as if by mutual, unspoken agreement, they had decided to erase that chapter from their family history, to pretend it had never happened. Elijah tried to return to the normal routines of a boy, his age, school, chores, occasional games of baseball with other boys in the vacant lot behind the church. But he felt marked, set apart, though no one in town knew what had happened. The secret knowledge weighed on him, aging him beyond his years. "You seem different lately, Elijah," his teacher, Miss Winters, remarked one afternoon as he lingered after class. "Is everything all right at home? I know this year's been difficult with your mother's passing." Elijah nodded, not meeting her concerned gaze. "I'm fine, Miss Winters. Just tired." "And your aunt?" "I heard she's gone to stay with relatives?" His hands tightened on his school books. "Yes, ma'am."
So?
"In Philadelphia. Well, please give her my regards when you write to her. She was always so attentive to you. A blessing, I'm sure, after losing your mother." The irony of her words twisted like a knife in Elijah's gut. He mumbled something polite and hurried away, the bile rising in his throat. That night, as wind rattled the window panes and sent dead leaves skittering across the porch, Elijah woke from a nightmare, his heart pounding, his nightshirt soaked with sweat. In the dream, Meredith had returned, her arms cradling a baby with his own face, her voice whispering terrible endearments as she approached his bed. Unable to fall back asleep, he lit a candle and crept downstairs for a glass of water. The house creaked and settled around him, its familiar sounds suddenly sinister in the midnight silence. As he passed the parlor, he noticed a faint light beneath the closed door. His father was home from his shift, then. Perhaps he, too, was unable to sleep. Elijah hesitated, then gently pushed the door open. Thomas sat in the armchair by the cold fireplace, a glass of amber liquid in one hand, an envelope in the other. He looked up as Elijah entered, his eyes red-rimmed and unfocused. "You should be in bed," he said, his words slightly slurred. "I had a bad dream." Elijah felt childish saying it, but it was the truth. Thomas nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense. "Me too, son. Except I don't get to wake up from mine." Elijah noticed the letter in his father's hand, the unfamiliar handwriting visible even from where he stood. "Is that from ... Dr. Whitaker," Thomas confirmed, tossing the letter onto the side table. "Your aunt is not adjusting well to the sanitarium. She's become violent, had to be restrained. Keeps insisting they're holding her against her will, that her husband will come for her." A chill ran down Elijah's spine. Her husband? But Uncle Herbert is dead. Thomas's laugh was hollow, devoid of humor. "She's not talking about Herbert." He looked directly at Elijah, his gaze both apologetic and accusatory. "She means you." The room seemed to tilt around Elijah, the floor unsteady beneath his feet. That's insane." "Yes," Thomas agreed, draining his glass. "She is insane. That's the diagnosis. Moral insanity, they call it. A perversion of the natural instincts." He refilled his glass from a decanter on the table, his hands shaking slightly. "The doctors say it happens sometimes after a traumatic loss. Herbert's death broke something in her mind." Elijah sank onto the sofa, his legs suddenly too weak to support him. "Will she get better?" Thomas stared into his glass, swirling the whiskey. "Dr. Whitaker doesn't think so. Says she's too far gone." He looked up, his eyes haunted. "She's my little sister, Elijah. I was supposed to protect her, just like I was supposed to protect you." The raw guilt in his father's voice made Elijah's chest ache. "It wasn't your fault, Father, wasn't it?" Thomas's voice broke. "I brought her into our home. I left you alone with her. I didn't see what was happening right under my nose. You couldn't have known," Elijah said. The roles suddenly reversed, the son comforting the father. Thomas shook his head, unconvinced. "The baby will be born next month. Dr. Whitaker has a couple lined up to adopt it. Good people, he says. From Boston. They'll never know, ... double quotes, he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "And then it will be over," Elijah said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We can put it all behind us." His father gave him a long, sad look. "Can we? Can you?" Elijah had no answer to that. The truth was, he didn't know if he could ever truly put this behind him, if the stain of what had happened would ever fade from his soul. They sat in silence for a long time, father and son united in their grief and guilt, while outside the October wind moaned around the eaves like a restless spirit. November arrived with an early snowfall that blanketed Millfield in white, transforming the town into a scene from a Christmas card. Children sledded down the hill behind the school, shopkeepers hung evergreen garlands in their windows, and preparations for Thanksgiving began in earnest. In the Blackwood house, the approaching holiday held little joy. Thomas had announced they would not be celebrating this year, citing his work schedule as the reason. Though Elijah suspected it had more to do with the baby that would be born around that time, the child that was his but would never know him, the living evidence of Meredith's corruption. On the 20th of November, a telegram arrived from Philadelphia. Elijah was returning from school when he saw the Western Union boy pedaling away from their house on his bicycle. Inside, he found his father at the kitchen table, the yellow paper spread before him, his face ashen. Father? What is it? Thomas looked up slowly, as if emerging from a trance. She's gone. Gone? Elijah repeated, not comprehending. You mean Aunt Meredith? Thomas nodded, pushing the telegram across the table. She escaped from the sanitarium last night. Somehow got hold of a key, overpowered a nurse. He rubbed his face with both hands. Suddenly, looking much older than his 40 years, the baby came early. A boy. She took him with her. The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment as Elijah tried to process this news. Meredith was free, and she had his child, their child, with her. The police are searching, Thomas continued, his voice hollow. But she had at least a 12-hour head start. Could be anywhere by now. She'd come here, Elijah said, certainty settling in his stomach like a stone. She'd come back to Millfield. His father shook his head. No, she wouldn't risk it. Everyone knows her here. Someone would recognize her. But Elijah remembered the look in Meredith's eyes as she was forced into the carriage months ago, the unspoken promise he had seen there. She would come back for him. He was sure of it. That night he barricaded his bedroom door with a chair and slept with his baseball bat beside him. Every creak of the old house, every gust of wind that rattled the windows jerked him from his fitful sleep. His heart racing, his ears straining for the sound of footsteps on the stairs. The days that followed were a peculiar kind of torture. Thomas contacted the police in Philadelphia daily, but there was never any news. Meredith had vanished as completely as if she had never existed, taking with her the infant who was both Elijah's son and cousin, a grotesque tangle of relationships that made his head spin when he thought about it too long. Thanksgiving came and went without celebration. December arrived with more snow and the festive atmosphere of Christmas preparations that Elijah observed with detached interest, like watching actors in a play performed for someone else's benefit. On Christmas Eve, most of Millfield gathered at the church for the annual candlelight service. Thomas, who had been avoiding public gatherings, surprised Elijah by suggesting they attend. It would look strange if we didn't, he explained as they walked through the snowy streets, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. People are already talking about how we've withdrawn since Meredith left. The church was warm and bright, decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, the altar adorned with poinsettias. Elijah and his father slipped into a pew near the back, nodding politely to neighbors who greeted them with holiday wishes. As Reverend Collins led the congregation in singing Silent Night, Elijah felt a strange prickling at the back of his neck, an inexplicable sense of being watched. He glanced around surreptitiously but saw only familiar faces illuminated by candlelight, their expressions peaceful as they sang of heavenly peace. The service ended with Joy to the World, the organist playing with enthusiastic vigor as the congregation filed out into the snowy night, exchanging Christmas greetings and good wishes for the new year of 1906. Elijah and Thomas walked home in comfortable silence, the tension between them eased somewhat by the simple beauty of the service and the kindness of their neighbors. For the first time in months, Elijah felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps they could move forward, that the shadow of Meredith might eventually recede. The Blackwood house was dark as they approached, no welcoming lights burning in the windows as there had been in years past when his mother was alive. Thomas fumbled with the key in the lock, then pushed the door open, reaching for the gas lamp in the entryway. "Don't turn it on," said a soft voice from the darkness of the parlor. "I prefer the shadows, don't you, Thomas?" Elijah froze on the threshold, his blood turning to ice in his veins. He knew that voice, had heard it in his nightmares for months. Thomas grabbed his son's arm, pushing him behind his own body as he peered into the darkness. "Meredith?" Match flared, illuminating a face that was both familiar and strange, thinner, wilder, the eyes sunken and feverish bright. Meredith sat in the armchair by the cold fireplace, a bundle cradled in her arms. "Merry Christmas, brother," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Won't you welcome us home?" Thomas's grip on Elijah's arm tightened painfully. "What are you doing here?" "The police are looking for you." Meredith laughed softly, the sound raising goosebumps on Elijah's arms. "Let them look. I'm right where I belong with my family." She shifted the bundle in her arms, and Elijah caught a glimpse of a tiny face, eyes closed in sleep. "Don't you want to meet your grandson Thomas, your son Elijah?" The world tilted sickeningly around Elijah. There in his living room on Christmas Eve was the impossible child, the physical manifestation of everything that had gone wrong in their lives, the innocent result of an unforgivable act. "Get out," Thomas said, his voice low and dangerous. "Get out of my house before I call the police myself." Meredith's smile faded, her eyes hardening. "You would turn away your own blood on Christmas Eve. What would your sainted wife say about that, I wonder?" "Don't you dare speak of her," Thomas snarled, taking a step forward. "You desecrated her home with your ... perversions. You violated my son. I loved him, Meredith interrupted, her voice rising. I still love him. We're meant to be together, the three of us. She looked past Thomas to where Elijah stood, frozen in horror. Come see your son, Elijah. He has your eyes. Thomas lunged forward, grabbing Meredith's arm and yanking her to her feet. The baby in her arms woke with a startled cry. Father, no, Elijah shouted, suddenly terrified for the infant caught between the two adults. But Thomas wasn't listening. Rage had overtaken him, months of suppressed anger and guilt exploding in a violent surge. You'll never touch him again, he growled, dragging Meredith toward the door. You'll never see either of them again. No! Meredith screamed, clutching the baby to her chest with one arm while she clawed at Thomas's face with her free hand. You can't separate us. He's mine. They're both mine. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Thomas released Meredith to protect his face from her nails. She stumbled backward, off balance, still holding the screaming infant. Her foot caught on the edge of the parlor rug. She fell, twisting as she did so, instinctively trying to protect the baby. There was a sickening crack as her head struck the corner of the marble-top side table. Then silence, broken only by the continued wailing of the infant. Thomas stood frozen, blood from the scratches on his face dripping onto his white shirt. Elijah rushed forward, kneeling beside his aunt's still form. Blood pooled beneath her head, dark against the patterned rug. Her eyes stared upward, unseeing, her face locked in an expression of surprise. The baby continued to cry, his tiny fists waving in the air, miraculously unharmed in the protective cage of his mother's arms. Carefully, Elijah lifted the infant, cradling him awkwardly against his chest. The boy quieted almost immediately, his cries subsiding to hiccuping sobs, then to silence as he gazed up at Elijah with unfocused newborn eyes. Father, Elijah whispered, looking up at Thomas, who still stood motionless, shock evident in every line of his body. Father, she's dead. Thomas moved then, dropping to his knees beside Meredith's body, pressing his fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse they both knew wouldn't be there. Oh God, he murmured, rocking back on his heels. Oh God, what have I done? It was an accident, Elijah said, his voice steadier than he felt. Anyone could see that. But even as he spoke, he knew how it would look to others. Thomas Blackwood, who had sent his pregnant sister away under mysterious circumstances, now discovered with her dead body in his home on Christmas Eve. Questions would be asked. Secrets would be revealed. The truth about the baby's parentage would come out. The baby. Elijah looked down at the tiny face, now peaceful in sleep. His son. His cousin. A tangle of blood relationships that should never have existed. An innocent born of sin who deserved a chance at life despite the circumstances of his conception. What do we do now? He asked, his voice small in the silent house. Thomas looked up, his gaze moving from his dead sister to the infant in Elijah's arms. Something shifted in his expression, resolve replacing shock. We bury her, he said quietly. In the woods behind the house. The ground isn't frozen yet beneath the snow. And then, ... double quotes, he hesitated, his eyes on the baby. And then, we leave. Tonight, take only what we can carry. Go somewhere no one knows us. Leave? Elijah repeated, the enormity of what his father was suggesting slowly sinking in. But where would we go? West, Thomas said, rising to his feet with new purpose. California, maybe, or Oregon. Somewhere we can start fresh. He looked at the baby again, his expression softening slightly. We'll say he's your brother. My son with a woman I met after your mother died. A woman who died in childbirth. A new lie to cover the old one. A fresh start built on the foundation of deception, but what choice did they have? As the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, marking the arrival of Christmas Day 1905, Elijah Blackwood looked down at the infant in his arms, his son, who would grow up believing he was his brother, and wondered if any of them would ever truly escape the shadow of what had happened in this house. In the years that followed, as they built a new life in a small Oregon logging town, as Thomas aged prematurely and died before his time, as the boy they named James grew into a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to both his brother and his father, Elijah often thought back to that Christmas Eve and the terrible choice they had made. He wondered sometimes what would have happened if they had told the truth, if they had let the law take its course. Would it have been better or worse than the life of secrets they had chosen? He never knew the answer. But on his deathbed in 1967, as an old man surrounded by children and grandchildren who never knew the truth of their origins, Elijah Blackwood finally made his peace with the past, whispering his confession to a startled young priest who would carry the secret to his own grave decades later. The macabre case of 1905 of a 13-year-old boy who fathered his aunt's child was buried with him. a dark chapter in a family history rewritten by the desperate need to survive and the hope that some sins, once buried deep enough, might eventually be forgotten. But as James's daughter would discover in 2018, while researching the family genealogy with a DNA test, some secrets refused to stay buried forever. For the autumn of 1933 brought more than just falling leaves to the small town of Millfield, Connecticut. As the Great Depression tightened its grip on America, the Harmon family mansion stood as a defiant monument to wealth that had somehow weathered the economic collapse. Perched on Blackwood Hill overlooking the town, the Victorian structure had been the subject of whispers for generations. Detective James Cooper pulled his Ford to a stop at the iron gates, the engine sputtering before falling silent. At 42, Cooper had seen his share of tragedy during his 15 years with the Millfield Police Department. But nothing had prepared him for the telephone call he'd received that morning. "You don't have to go in alone," said Officer Patterson, a fresh-faced recruit who'd been assigned to Cooper just 3 months prior. "This isn't your ordinary case, kid," Cooper replied, lighting a cigarette. "The Harmons own half this town. Whatever happened in there needs to be handled with discretion." The gates creaked open as the elderly groundskeeper, Milton Farnsworth, emerged from the gatehouse. His face was ashen, eyes bloodshot from what Cooper assumed was either lack of sleep or excessive crying. "They're expecting you, Detective," Milton said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Elizabeth is in the study with the family lawyer." Cooper nodded, proceeding up the winding gravel driveway flanked by perfectly manicured hedges. The mansion loomed larger with each step, its windows like vacant eyes watching his approach. The October wind carried the scent of decaying leaves and something else. Something Cooper couldn't quite place, but made his stomach turn. The massive oak door opened before he could knock. Clara, the Harmons' longtime housekeeper, stood in the doorway. Normally impeccably presented, today her hair had escaped its usual tight bun, and her uniform was wrinkled. "This way, Detective," she said, leading him through the grand foyer with its marble floors and crystal chandelier. Family portraits lined the walls, generations of Harmons staring down with expressions of superiority and judgment. Cooper noticed that the most recent portrait, that of William Harmon and his wife Margaret, had been turned to face the wall. The study door was ajar, and Cooper could hear hushed voices inside. He recognized Elizabeth Harmon's soft tones immediately. The 25-year-old heiress had been a fixture in local society pages since her debutante ball 7 years ago. As Cooper entered, Elizabeth looked up from her conversation with Gregory Winters, the family attorney. Her porcelain complexion was marred by dark circles under her eyes, and her hands trembled as she clutched a handkerchief. "Detective Cooper," she said, attempting a polite smile that never reached her eyes. "Thank you for coming so quickly." "Miss Harmon," Cooper nodded, removing his hat. "Mr. Winters." The lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, merely nodded in acknowledgement. "I understand you found something in the attic," Cooper said, getting straight to the point. "Something concerning your father." Elizabeth's composure cracked slightly. "Not just something, Detective. Everything. The journals, the photographs, the ... evidence." She glanced at Winters, who gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. "My father has been dead for 3 months now, and I've been sorting through his belongings. Yesterday I found a hidden compartment behind the bookshelf in his private study upstairs." She reached for a leather-bound journal on the desk. "What I discovered makes me question everything I thought I knew about my family. And after reading these, I believe my father was responsible for multiple deaths spanning decades." Cooper felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Harmon." "I know," Elizabeth whispered, "but I also know what must be done. My father's secrets can no longer remain buried, just like his victims." Cooper spent hours in William Harmon's private study, methodically examining the contents of the hidden compartment. The room itself was a testament to privileged leather-bound books lining mahogany shelves, a Globe bar cart holding crystal decanters, and a massive desk that had likely witnessed the signing of deals that shaped Millfield's destiny. The journals were meticulously kept, William Harmon's elegant handwriting detailing business transactions, social engagements, and personal reflections dating back to 1890 when he was just 15 years old. Cooper had expected to find explicit confessions of murder, but what he discovered was far more disturbing, a calculated chronicle of manipulation, coercion, and what William himself referred to as necessary adjustments to the family line. "He writes about people as if they were livestock," Cooper muttered to himself, turning pages filled with clinical assessments of potential marriage partners for various family members, evaluations of their genetic qualities and financial assets. A series of photographs caught Cooper's attention, black and white images, yellowed with age, showing William with various women. What struck Cooper wasn't the number of women. Williams's reputation as a widower who enjoyed female company was well known, but the unsettling similarity in their appearances. All shared the same heart-shaped face, high cheekbones, and delicate build of the Harmon women. Elizabeth returned with a silver tray bearing coffee. She'd composed herself somewhat, though her hands still trembled as she poured. Did you know any of these women?" Cooper asked, gesturing to the photographs. Elizabeth's eyes darted over the images. "Some. This one," she pointed to a young woman with dark hair, "was introduced as a distant cousin who stayed with us briefly when I was about 12. Father called her Madeline. She left suddenly. He told me she'd received news of a sick relative." Elizabeth's voice faltered. "There were many such cousins over the years," Cooper nodded, making a note. "And this one?" He indicated a photograph of William standing beside a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Elizabeth herself. Elizabeth's face drained of color. "That's my mother, or who I was told was my mother, Margaret. She died when I was 3, pneumonia, according to Father." She set her coffee cup down with a clatter. "But now I don't know what to believe." Cooper turned to a journal entry dated June 17, 1907. William had written, "M has fulfilled her purpose. The child is perfect exactly as designed. I've eliminated all documentation of her true lineage. As far as society is concerned, Elizabeth is the daughter of Margaret and myself. No one need ever know she is actually the product of Josephine and Thomas. My experiment in selective family traits has yielded exactly the specimen I desired." Elizabeth watched Cooper's expression darken as he read. "That's not the worst of it," she said quietly. "Keep reading." The detective turned to entries from 1928 when Elizabeth was 20. William had written extensive notes about potential husbands for his daughter, rejecting dozens of suitors for various genetic inadequacies. Then, a disturbing pattern emerged. William's growing obsession with what he called the perfect continuation of the line. December 15, 1928, "Elizabeth remains resistant to my selections, but time grows short. I must take matters into my own hands. The future of the Harmon bloodline cannot be left to chance or youthful whims. I have made the necessary arrangements." Cooper looked up sharply. "What arrangements?" Elizabeth's hands were shaking violently now. 3 months later, I became ill. I was bedridden for weeks. Dr. Reynolds' father's personal physician treated me. I have no memory of much of that time." She drew a shuddering breath. 9 months later, I gave birth to a son." Cooper felt his blood run cold. "You have a child?" had Elizabeth whispered. "Father told me the baby died shortly after birth. I was devastated but too weak to question anything. I was never allowed to see him." Her voice broke. "But according to the journals, my son didn't die. Father gave him to a selected family to raise according to his specifications." Cooper struggled to maintain his professional demeanor. "And the father of this child?" Elizabeth's eyes met his, filled with horror and revulsion. "According to my father's journals, he arranged for artificial insemination." She could barely form the words. Using his own ... specimen, Cooper left the Harmon mansion as dusk settled over Millfield, his notebook filled with dates, names, and locations extracted from William's journals. The implications were staggering, not just the suggestion that William had orchestrated his own daughter's pregnancy using his genetic material, but the hints of a decades-long pattern of manipulation, possible kidnappings, and deaths disguised as accidents or illness. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Patterson remarked as Cooper slid into the passenger seat of the police car. Cooper had called for backup after realizing the scope of the investigation. "Worse than ghosts," Cooper replied, lighting a cigarette with unsteady hands. "Get us to the station. We need to start pulling records. Over the next 48 hours. Cooper and Patterson worked relentlessly, cross-referencing Williams' journals with missing persons reports, death certificates, and property records. A disturbing pattern emerged, young women from surrounding counties disappearing, only to briefly surface in Millfield as relatives of the Harmon family before vanishing again. Death certificates signed by Dr. Reynolds. Properties purchased in remote locations under shell companies traced back to Harmon Enterprises. He was building some kind of genetic dynasty, Patterson said, rubbing his tired eyes as they stood before a corkboard now covered with photographs and index cards. But why? What was the purpose? Cooper pointed to a passage he'd copied from one of the later journals. The Harmon bloodline must remain pure, enhanced only by carefully selected traits. The outside world is deteriorating, economic collapse, moral degradation, genetic pollution. Only through careful stewardship can superior bloodlines survive. I have created the perfect continuation. Elizabeth's child carries the distilled essence of generations of careful selection. He saw himself as some kind of eugenicist, Cooper said grimly. These ideas were gaining popularity in certain circles before the crash. Some wealthy families became obsessed with genetic purity and superior bloodlines. William took it to an extreme. Patterson shook his head in disbelief. And the son? Elizabeth's child? Cooper pulled out a property deed. According to the journals, William placed the boy with the Caldwell family in Harborview, about 40 miles north of here. Thomas Caldwell works for one of Harmon's shipping companies. The boy would be 5 years old now. We need to verify he's there and that he's safe, Patterson said. Cooper nodded. And we need to speak with Dr. Reynolds. If he participated in whatever William did to Elizabeth, double quotes, his face hardened. That's criminal. The telephone on Cooper's desk rang shrilly, cutting through the tension. He answered, his expression growing increasingly grave as he listened. We'll be right there, he said finally, hanging up. That was Clara from the Harmon house. Elizabeth is missing, along with several journals and her father's car. She left a note saying she was going to make things right. Harborview, Patterson said, already reaching for his hat. Get the car, Cooper ordered, grabbing his coat, and call ahead to the Harborview police. Tell them to send someone to the Caldwell residence immediately, but to be discreet. We don't know what state of mind Elizabeth is in, but if she's learned where her son is being kept. The drive to Harborview was tense, the winding coastal road treacherous in the gathering darkness. Cooper's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. If Elizabeth had indeed gone to confront the Caldwells or reclaim her son, there was no telling what might happen. A woman who had just discovered such a profound betrayal could not be expected to act rationally. As they crested the hill overlooking Harborview, they could see emergency vehicle lights flashing near the harbor. Cooper's stomach sank. Faster, he urged Patterson, who was already pushing the Ford to its limits. They screeched to a halt behind a Harborview police car parked outside an elegant gray clapboard house overlooking the water. An officer rushed to meet them. Detective Cooper? I'm Officer Wells. We arrived about 10 minutes ago, but he looked shaken. You better come inside. The front door of the Caldwell home stood open, the immaculate interior at odds with the violence that had occurred in the study. Thomas Caldwell lay slumped across his desk, a gunshot wound to his chest. His wife, Caroline, was crumpled on the floor nearby, still clutching a telephone. No sign of the child, Wells reported. Neighbors heard the shots and called it in. They say Mrs. Caldwell was screaming about a woman taking her son. Cooper surveyed the scene grimly. Did they get a description of the woman or the vehicle? Dark-haired woman in an expensive-looking blue dress, driving a black Packard sedan. Wells hesitated. One neighbor mentioned the woman was calling the boy my son, as she dragged him to the car. Said the boy was screaming for his mother. Mrs. Caldwell, that is. Cooper exchanged a look with Patterson. He wouldn't know Elizabeth as his mother. To him, Caroline Caldwell was the only mother he'd ever known. We need to find them before this gets worse, Patterson said quietly. Any idea where she might go? Cooper thought of the massive Harmon mansion with its countless rooms, the remote properties he'd discovered in William's records, the family's private island off the Maine coast. Elizabeth had resources, knowledge of her father's hidden assets, and now, a desperate mission. I might, he said finally, but we need to hurry. This isn't just about Elizabeth anymore. There's a terrified child involved, a child who just witnessed something no 5-year-old should ever see. Rain lashed against the windshield. As Cooper and Patterson followed the coastal road north toward the remote fishing village of Stonehaven, Cooper had found references in William's journals to a property there, a converted lighthouse that had been in the Harmon family for generations, used primarily as a summer retreat but maintained year-round by a caretaker. Do you think she'd go there? Patterson asked, straining to see through the downpour. It's isolated, familiar to her, and not officially listed among the family holdings, Cooper replied. Perfect if you're looking to disappear with a child. The village appeared through the rain as a cluster of lights huddled against the darkness of the sea. Most buildings were shuttered for the coming winter, the fishing season largely concluded. Cooper directed Patterson to the local tavern, the only establishment showing signs of life, warm light spilling from its windows onto the wet cobblestones. Inside, a handful of weathered fishermen looked up suspiciously as the two officers entered. Cooper approached the bartender, showing his badge. Millfield Police. We're looking for Elizabeth Harmon. She might have passed through here earlier today, possibly with a young boy. The bartender's expression remained neutral, but Cooper caught the flicker of recognition in his eyes. Haven't seen any strangers, the man said, polishing a glass with deliberate care. Especially not any Harmons. One of the fishermen snorted. Tommy here wouldn't tell you if he had. The Harmons own the cannery that keeps half this village employed during winter. Cooper leaned in closer. A child's life may be at risk. Whatever loyalty you feel toward the Harmons, ask yourself if it extends to protecting a kidnapper. The bartender's composure cracked slightly. I didn't say nothing about a kidnapping. Miss Elizabeth has been coming to Stonehaven since she was a girl. If she's visiting her family property with her son, that's her business. So she is at the lighthouse, Cooper pressed. After a moment's hesitation, the bartender nodded. Arrived about 3 hours ago. Asked for supplies, food, blankets, lamp oil. Said she might be staying a while. He frowned. The boy seemed scared, but she said he was just tired from traveling. I didn't think much of it. How do we get to the lighthouse? Patterson asked. Road ends about a mile north of town. Then there's a path along the cliffs. In this weather, though... ... The bartender shook his head. It's treacherous. One wrong step and you're in the Atlantic. Cooper checked his watch. Nearly midnight. We'll need a guide. None of the men volunteered until an elderly fisherman in the corner spoke up. I'll take you. I've been walking that path for 60 years. Could do it blindfolded. He stood, revealing a slight limp. Name's Caleb. Used to do maintenance work at the lighthouse before old man Harmon hired that mainlander. The journey to the lighthouse was every bit as dangerous as the bartender had warned. The narrow path hugged the cliff face, slick with rain and occasionally illuminated by flashes of lightning. Caleb moved with surprising agility despite his age and infirmity, leading them with confidence even as the wind threatened to push them toward the edge. The lighthouse appeared suddenly as they rounded a bend, a stark white tower attached to a stone cottage, a single light glowing from one of the windows. Cooper signaled for Patterson to circle around to the rear entrance while he and Caleb approached from the front. "Elizabeth Harmon," Cooper called out, pounding on the heavy wooden door. "This is Detective Cooper. We need to speak with you." Silence, save for the howling wind and crashing waves below. Cooper tried again, then tested the door handle. It turned easily in his hand. The cottage interior was warm, a fire crackling in the stone hearth. Toys were scattered across the floor, a wooden train set, building blocks, a teddy bear. Cooper moved cautiously through the main room, signaling Caleb to stay by the door. "Elizabeth?" he called again, softer now. A floorboard creaked overhead. Cooper drew his service revolver and ascended the narrow staircase, each step groaning beneath his weight. The upper floor contained 2 bedrooms and access to the lighthouse tower. The door to one bedroom stood ajar, and Cooper could hear a woman's voice, soft and melodic, reading a children's story. He pushed the door open to find Elizabeth sitting on the edge of a bed, a leather-bound book open in her lap. The boy, unmistakably a Harmon with his dark hair and distinctive features, was tucked beneath a patchwork quilt, his eyes wide with a combination of fear and confusion. Elizabeth looked up, unsurprised. "Detective Cooper. I wondered how long it would take you to find us." Her voice was calm, detached, as if they were meeting at a social function rather than after a double homicide. "Elizabeth, you need to come with me," Cooper said gently, keeping his revolver lowered but visible. "What happened at the Caldwells was necessary," she interrupted. "They stole my son. They were part of my father's sick experiment." She stroked the boy's hair. "This is William Jr., my son, named after his father and grandfather." Her laugh was brittle. "He's already his cousin's father and brother." "A twisted family line indeed," the boy whimpered, shrinking away from her touch. Cooper could see bruising on the child's arm where Elizabeth had likely dragged him from the Caldwell home. "He doesn't know you, Elizabeth," Cooper said carefully. To him, Caroline Caldwell was his mother. Thomas was his father. And he saw you hurt them. Elizabeth's expression hardened. They were never his parents. They were my father's puppets, raising my son according to his specifications. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket. "It's all documented here, Thomas Caldwell's agreement to raise the child. The payments, the regular reports back to my father about the boy's development." Patterson appeared in the doorway behind Cooper, signaling that he'd secured the rest of the building. "Where were you planning to go?" Cooper asked, taking a small step closer. "Away from here. Somewhere they'd never find us." Elizabeth's eyes took on a feverish gleam. "I've found other properties my father kept secret. Places even his lawyers don't know about. We could disappear. And what about William Jr.? A life on the run, away from everything he's ever known?" Elizabeth's certainty faltered momentarily. "He would learn to love me. I'm his mother." "You're scaring him, Elizabeth," Cooper said softly, gesturing to the trembling child. "Look at him." For the first time, Elizabeth seemed to truly see the terror in her son's eyes. Her hand, still stroking his hair, paused. "I didn't want to hurt them," she whispered. "I just wanted my son back. But Thomas tried to stop me. Caroline was calling the police, ... double quotes, her composure cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. "My father took everything from me, my choice, my body, my child. I just wanted something back." Cooper holstered his revolver and cautiously sat on the edge of the bed. "I believe you, Elizabeth. What your father did was monstrous. But this," he gestured to the frightened boy, "this isn't the way. William Jr. is innocent in all this. He deserves stability, safety, With who? Elizabeth demanded. The people who have been raising him are dead. Because of me. The full weight of her actions seemed to hit her suddenly. Oh God, what have I done? Let me help you, Cooper said. Both of you. There's still a way through this. Outside, the storm intensified, lightning illuminating the room in stark flashes. The boy began to cry softly, and Elizabeth's maternal instinct finally overcame her desperation. She gathered him gently into her arms. I'm sorry, she murmured, rocking him. I'm so sorry. Cooper nodded to Patterson, who quietly left a radio for additional support. The long night was far from over, but the immediate danger had passed. As he watched Elizabeth comfort the child she had both lost and found, Cooper knew the coming days would bring hard questions and harder answers. The Harmon family secrets, buried for generations, had finally surfaced, leaving destruction and broken lives in their wake. The Millfield courthouse was packed to capacity on the morning of Elizabeth Harmon's arraignment. News of the sensational case had spread beyond the town limits, attracting reporters from newspapers as far away as Boston and New York. The Harmon name, once synonymous with wealth and respectability, was now irrevocably linked to one of the most disturbing scandals in Connecticut history. Cooper sat in the second row directly behind the prosecutor's table. He'd barely slept in the 2 weeks since the night at the lighthouse, working tirelessly to build a case that encompassed not just the Caldwell murders but the decades of crimes committed by William Harmon. Elizabeth entered the courtroom in handcuffs, escorted by 2 female officers. Gone were the expensive dresses and carefully styled hair. She wore a simple gray dress, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Despite the circumstances, she carried herself with the same innate dignity that had been instilled in generations of Harmon women. As the judge entered and the proceedings began, Cooper found his attention drawn to Gregory Winters, seated at the defense table beside Elizabeth. The family lawyer had initially distanced himself from the case, claiming shock at the revelations. But as the Harmon fortune began to crumble under public scrutiny and assets were frozen pending investigation, Winters had suddenly reappeared, offering his services to Elizabeth. Cooper didn't trust him. His examination of William's journals had revealed Winters' name in multiple entries, particularly regarding the legal maneuvering needed to arrange the adoption of Elizabeth's son by the Caldwells. While Winters might not have known the full extent of William's eugenics program, he had certainly been complicit in parts of it. The charges against Elizabeth were read aloud: 2 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, breaking and entering, and various lesser offenses. The courtroom murmured as the prosecutor detailed the events at the Caldwell home, painting Elizabeth as a calculating killer who had executed Thomas Caldwell and his wife in cold blood before abducting their son. When given the opportunity to enter her plea, Elizabeth stood, her voice clear and unwavering. Not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. The prosecutor requested Elizabeth be held without bail, citing her resources and the risk of flight. Winters argued passionately for house arrest, claiming the Harmon mansion could be secured and Elizabeth monitored. Your Honor, Cooper interjected, rising from his seat, the Millfield Police Department strongly opposes any arrangement that would place the defendant in the Harmon mansion. That location is still an active crime scene in our ongoing investigation into William Harmon's activities. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, who had known the Harmon family socially for decades, regarded Cooper with barely concealed disdain. Detective Cooper, while I appreciate the department's diligence, surely your investigation doesn't require access to the entire mansion? It does, Your Honor, Cooper insisted. We've discovered evidence of multiple crimes spanning decades, potentially involving numerous victims. The mansion contains crucial evidence. After further debate, the judge ruled that Elizabeth would be held at the Women's Correctional Facility pending trial, but with special accommodations befitting her status and health concerns, a decision that made Cooper's jaw clench in frustration. Even in disgrace, the Harmon influence seemed to ensure preferential treatment. As the courtroom cleared, Cooper found himself face to face with Winters in the hallway. Quite the zealous investigation you're conducting, Detective, the lawyer remarked, straightening his tie. One might think you have a personal vendetta against the Harmon family. Just following the evidence, Counselor Cooper replied evenly. Speaking of which, I'll be requesting a subpoena for your records regarding your work for William Harmon, particularly concerning the Caldwell adoption. Winter's smile never faltered, but his eyes hardened. My files are protected by attorney-client privilege, even when those files might demonstrate your knowledge of or participation in criminal activity? I don't think so, Cooper leaned closer. William kept meticulous records. Mr. Winters, your name appears frequently. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across the lawyer's face. William Harmon was an eccentric man with unusual ideas about family legacy. but I assure you I never participated in anything illegal. We'll see, Cooper said, turning to leave. Oh, and you might want to postpone any travel plans. We'll be conducting formal interviews with all of Williams' associates in the coming weeks. Outside the courthouse, Cooper found Patterson waiting beside their car, smoking a cigarette. How'd it go? The younger officer asked. About as expected, Cooper sighed. The judge is giving her every consideration. And Winters is running defense like his life depends on it. He paused. Which it might. Patterson nodded toward a black sedan parked across the street where a well-dressed man watched them intently. That's the third time I've seen that car today. Think we're being followed? Cooper studied the vehicle. Probably. The Harmons have connections in every corner of this state. We need to be careful. Lock up evidence, duplicate records, keep everything by the book. What about the boy? Patterson asked as they got into their car. William Jr.? Cooper's expression softened slightly. He's with his maternal grandparents, Carolyn Caldwell's parents. They live in Vermont. Seems like good people, devastated by their daughter's death, but committed to giving their grandson stability. He shook his head. Kid's life has been turned upside down twice now. First by William's twisted experiment, then by Elizabeth's actions. Will she get visitation rights? Eventually, maybe, if she's found not guilty by reason of insanity and completes treatment. But that's years down the road. Cooper started the engine. For now, our focus needs to be on building an airtight case and figuring out just how far William Harmon's experiments went. Those journals mentioned other arrangements and specimens. I think there might be more children out there who were part of his program. As they pulled away from the courthouse, Cooper couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of the Harmon family secrets. In his 15 years of police work, he'd learned that wealth and power were the perfect shields for depravity, and the Harmons had possessed both in abundance for generations. The black sedan pulled out behind them, maintaining a discreet distance. Cooper made a mental note of the license plate, then deliberately took a circuitous route back to the station. This case would require vigilance on every level, not just in the collection of evidence, but in watching their own backs. The Harmon dynasty might be crumbling, but its influence reached far and deep. And somewhere in the shadows, Cooper suspected, were others who had participated in William's twisted vision, people who would go to great lengths to ensure their involvement remained hidden. Dr. Harold Reynolds' office occupied the top floor of the medical building on Millfield's Main Street. The physician had served the town's elite families for over 30 years, his credentials and old-world manners ensuring a loyal clientele despite his advancing age. At 72, Reynolds still maintained a practice, though he'd scaled back his hours considerably in recent years. Cooper and Patterson arrived for their scheduled interview to find the doctor's waiting room empty, his receptionist conspicuously absent. A note on the desk indicated she had left early due to illness. Convenient timing, Cooper thought. Reynolds greeted them himself, ushering them into his wood-paneled office with a professional cordiality that didn't quite mask his unease. The physician was immaculately dressed in a three-piece suit, his silver hair neatly combed, but Cooper noticed a slight tremor in his hands as he offered them seats. Gentlemen, I've set aside an hour for our discussion, as requested, Reynolds said, settling behind his desk. Though I must say I'm not entirely clear on how I can assist your investigation. My relationship with the Harmon family was strictly professional. Cooper removed Williams's journal from his briefcase and placed it on the desk. Dr. Reynolds, we're investigating multiple crimes committed by William Harmon, potentially with the assistance of various professionals, including medical practitioners. Reynolds' eyes fixated on the journal. I see. And you believe I was somehow involved? We know you were, Patterson interjected. The journals are explicit about your role in what happened to Elizabeth Harmon in March of 1928. The doctor's composure slipped momentarily before he regained control. Detective Cooper, I've been practicing medicine for nearly 50 years. During that time, I've treated countless patients with complete professionalism and adherence to medical ethics, including when you sedated Elizabeth Harmon without her informed consent and performed artificial insemination using her father's genetic material, Cooper asked bluntly. Is that your definition of medical ethics, Doctor? Reynolds blanched. That's a preposterous accusation. Cooper opened the journal to a marked page and read aloud. March 17, 1928. Reynolds performed the procedure as arranged. Elizabeth remains unaware, believing she's being treated for anemia. I have compensated him generously for his discretion and expertise. The continuation of the pure Harmon line is now assured. He looked up. William documented everything, Doctor. Dates, procedures, payments. Reynolds' professional facade crumbled. He removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. You don't understand the position I was in. William Harmon wasn't someone you refused. You're a doctor, Patterson said, disgust evident in his voice. Your obligation is to your patient, not to some rich man's twisted fantasies. You think I don't know that? Reynolds snapped, suddenly angry. You think I haven't lived with this for 5 years? William came to me with his ... proposal. And when I refused, he showed me documentation of a medical error I'd made early in my career. Mistake that would have ended my practice, destroyed my reputation. He shook his head. He owned me after that. Cooper leaned forward. So you violated a young woman, your patient, because you were being blackmailed? I told myself I was protecting her, Reynolds said weakly. William said if I refused, he would find someone less qualified, someone who might harm her. At least I could ensure the procedure was performed safely. He laughed bitterly. The rationalizations we create to live with ourselves. Were there others? Cooper pressed. Other women William manipulated for his eugenics program. Reynolds hesitated, then nodded slowly. Several over the years. William was obsessed with creating what he called the perfect Harmon. He believed certain physical and intellectual traits could be cultivated through selective breeding. The doctor's professional detachment returned as he slipped into clinical language. He would identify women with desired characteristics, usually distant relations with some Harmon blood, and arrange for them to visit Millfield. Some became mistresses, others were hired as staff. All eventually became pregnant. And the children? Patterson asked. Some remained with their mothers, who were established in homes owned by William. Others were placed with selected families who reported regularly on their development. William tracked all of them, maintaining detailed records of their growth, intelligence, health. Reynolds shuddered. He spoke of them as specimens, not people. Cooper made notes as Reynolds talked, each revelation adding to the horrifying picture of William Harmon's decades-long eugenic experiment. By the time the doctor finished, Cooper had names and approximate locations for 7 children William had fathered with different women, all part of his twisted vision for a purified Harmon bloodline. I'll need formal statements about all of this, Cooper said finally. And you understand that your involvement constitutes multiple criminal offenses. Reynolds nodded, suddenly looking every one of his 72 years. I know. I've been expecting this day since William died. Perhaps even hoping for it. He reached into his desk drawer and removed a thick manila envelope. These are copies of all my records regarding the Harmon cases. I prepared them when I heard about Elizabeth's arrest. Cooper accepted the envelope, surprised. You're cooperating voluntarily? I'm dying, Detective, Reynolds said matter-of-factly. Pancreatic cancer. 6 months at most. I'd prefer to face justice in this life rather than carry these sins to the next. He smiled sadly. And perhaps my testimony might help Elizabeth. Whatever her crimes, she was first a victim of her father, of me, of all those who enabled William's madness. As they left the medical building, Patterson was unusually quiet. Finally, as they reached their car, he spoke. How far does this go, Cooper? How many people were involved? How many lives destroyed? Cooper looked back at Reynolds' office window, where the elderly doctor stood watching them. I don't know, kid. But we're gonna find out, no matter how ugly it gets or who's involved. Back at the station, they began organizing the new information, adding Reynolds' documents to their growing case file. The doctor's records were meticulous, containing medical histories of the women William had targeted, prenatal care notes, and tracking of the resulting children through their early development. It's like he was breeding racehorses, Patterson muttered, spreading the papers across Cooper's desk. Look at these notations: skull measurements, height projections, intelligence assessments of infants. It's sick. Cooper was focused on a map they'd created, placing pins at the locations of each child identified in Reynolds' records. Notice the pattern? All within a 100-mile radius of Millfield. Close enough for William to monitor. Far enough to avoid connections being made. Chief Wallace appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. Cooper, got a minute? In the privacy of the chief's office, Wallace didn't mince words. The mayor's office called twice. The Harmon family's attorneys are filing harassment claims against the department. They're saying you're on a witch hunt, damaging the reputation of a pillar of the community with baseless accusations. William, Harmon was a monster who used his money and influence to carry out horrific crimes for decades. Cooper replied flatly. We have documented evidence. Wallace held up a hand. I know that. But you need to understand the pressure building here. The Harmons funded the hospital wing, the library, half the town's infrastructure. People don't want to believe this about them. Truth doesn't care what people want to believe. Chief? No, but politics does. Wallace sighed heavily. Look, I'm backing you 100%. But tread carefully. Document everything. Triple-check your evidence. Because when this goes to trial, it won't just be Elizabeth Harmon in the defendant's chair, it'll be the entire Harmon legacy. and this town has a vested interest in preserving at least some of that legacy. The summer heat bore down on Millfield as July 1934 arrived, bringing with it Elizabeth Harmon's trial. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and spectators seeking refuge from the sweltering temperature, all waiting for the day's proceedings to begin. Inside, the courtroom was only marginally cooler, electric fans circulating the stale air as jurors fanned themselves with notebooks. Cooper sat rigidly in his designated seat, watching as Elizabeth was led in by guards. 7 months in custody had changed her. She was thinner, her posture less commanding, but her eyes remained alert and intelligent. The prosecution had presented its case over the previous 2 weeks, methodically establishing Elizabeth's movements on the day of the Caldwell murders, presenting forensic evidence linking her to the crime scene, and emphasizing the premeditated nature of her actions. Today, the defense would begin calling witnesses, starting with Dr. Reynolds. The elderly physician had deteriorated significantly since Cooper's interview in November. Now gaunt and frail, he required assistance to reach the witness stand, but his voice remained strong as he was sworn in, his medical authority evident despite his failing health. Gregory Winters conducted the questioning, guiding Reynolds through a carefully constructed narrative of William Harmon's manipulation and Elizabeth's victimization. Reynolds testified about the sedation, the procedure performed without Elizabeth's knowledge or consent, and William's subsequent orchestration of the adoption. "In your professional opinion, Dr. Reynolds," Winters asked, "what effect would the discovery of these events have had on Miss Harmon's mental state?" Reynolds looked directly at Elizabeth. "The revelation would have been profoundly traumatic. To learn that your body was violated, that your child was taken from you through deception, that your own father was responsible, the psychological impact would be devastating. It could absolutely trigger a dissociative episode or temporary psychosis." The prosecutor's cross-examination was aggressive, attempting to undermine Reynolds' credibility by highlighting his own criminal complicity and suggesting his terminal diagnosis made him an unreliable witness with nothing to lose. But Reynolds remained composed, acknowledging his culpability while maintaining the essential facts of his testimony. During the lunch recess, Cooper found himself sharing a bench outside the courthouse with Clara, the Harmon family's longtime housekeeper, who was scheduled to testify that afternoon. "They don't understand what it was like in that house," Clara said quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "Working for him, living under his roof. William Harmon owned People Detective. Not legally, perhaps, but in every way that mattered." Cooper studied her weathered face. "Did you know about what he did to Elizabeth?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Not all of it. Not the ... procedure. But I knew something terrible had happened during her illness. She was never the same afterward." She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "I should have done something, said something. Why didn't you?" "Fear," she admitted. "And not just for my position. William had ways of dealing with problems. People who crossed him tended to suffer misfortunes." She lowered her voice further. "There was a groundskeeper years ago. He discovered William with one of the cousins in a compromising situation. The man threatened to tell Mrs. Harmon. A week later, he was found drowned in the pond on the East property. William called it a tragic accident, even paid for the funeral." Cooper made a mental note to revisit that death. "You're doing the right thing now, Clara. Your testimony could help Elizabeth." Clara nodded sadly. "It's too late for so many others, though, isn't it?" The afternoon session brought a surprise development. As Clara completed her testimony about the controlling atmosphere of the Harmon household and William's obsession with bloodlines, Winters called his next witness, Dr. Marion Whitfield, a psychiatrist who had been evaluating Elizabeth since her arrest. Dr. Whitfield, a stern-looking woman in her 50s, testified that Elizabeth suffered from a combination of post-traumatic stress and a dissociative disorder triggered by the discovery of her father's actions. In the moment she confronted the Caldwells, Dr. Whitfield explained, Miss Harmon was experiencing a psychotic break. She was not fully aware of her actions or their consequences. She was, in essence, reliving the trauma of her own victimization, fighting against those she perceived as participating in the theft of her child. The prosecutor objected repeatedly, but the judge allowed the testimony to continue. Cooper watched the jury's reactions carefully, noting the conflicted expressions as they processed the horrific details of Elizabeth's ordeal against the brutal reality of the Caldwell murders. As the session concluded for the day, Cooper found himself wondering about the ultimate question of justice in this case. Elizabeth had undeniably killed 2 people in cold blood. Yet she had also been the victim of an unspeakable violation, her body used without her consent, her child stolen, her entire life built on elaborate lies constructed by her father. Where did justice lie in such a tangled web of victimization and violence? The trial's most dramatic moment came on its 10th day when Elizabeth Harmon took the stand in her own defense. The courtroom fell silent as she was sworn in, the spectators leaning forward in anticipation. Winters began gently, establishing Elizabeth's upbringing in the Harmon mansion, her relationship with her father, and the controlled environment in which she had been raised. Then he guided her toward the critical period. "Miss Harmon, please tell the court about the day you discovered your father's journals." Elizabeth's voice was soft but clear. "It was October 15th of last year. I was going through father's personal study, organizing his papers. Behind his bookshelf, I found a hidden compartment containing journals dating back to his youth." She paused, visibly struggling to maintain composure. "At first, I was simply curious. Then I began to read about his theories on bloodlines, his plans for the perfect Harmon, and finally I found the entries about me." "What did those entries reveal?" Winters prompted. "That I had been ... Elizabeth faltered, then continued with renewed determination. "That I had been artificially inseminated while unconscious, using my father's genetic material. That I had given birth to a son who hadn't died as I'd been told, but had been placed with the Caldwell family. That my entire life had been part of my father's experiment in eugenics." A murmur ran through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. "And how did this discovery affect you?" Winters asked. "At first I couldn't believe it. I thought perhaps father had been writing fiction or that he had become delusional in his later years." Elizabeth's hands trembled slightly. "But then I found photographs, documents, birth records. The evidence was overwhelming." "What did you do then?" "I contacted Detective Cooper. I wanted justice for myself and for others mentioned in the journals. But as the investigation proceeded, I became fixated on my son, the child I'd carried but never held, the baby I'd mourned who was actually alive." Elizabeth's eyes grew distant. "I began having nightmares, flashbacks to my illness. I couldn't eat or sleep. All I could think about was my son living with strangers who were part of my father's sick plan." Winters guided her through the days leading up to the Caldwell murders, establishing her deteriorating mental state, her growing obsession with reclaiming her child, and finally, the fateful day itself. "I remember driving to their house," Elizabeth said, her voice now hollow. "I remember knocking on the door. Thomas Caldwell recognized me. He'd met me at several of father's business functions. He invited me in." She closed her eyes briefly. "After that, everything becomes fragmented. I remember Thomas shouting, trying to block my path to the stairs. I remember Caroline on the telephone. I remember a gun father's revolver that I'd taken from his desk." "Do you remember shooting them?" Winters asked gently. "Not the actual moment, no. Just ... afterward. The silence. And William Jr. standing in the doorway of his room, staring at me with such fear." Tears slid down Elizabeth's cheeks. "I told him I was his mother, that I had come to take him home. But of course to him I was a stranger. A monster who had hurt the only parents he'd ever known." During cross-examination, the prosecutor attempted to portray Elizabeth as calculating rather than psychotic, emphasizing the planning that went into her visit to the Caldwell home, the gun, the timing when she knew the child would be home from school, the escape route to the lighthouse property. Elizabeth acknowledged these facts but maintained she had existed in a dissociative state, driven by overwhelming trauma and grief. "I'm not saying I shouldn't be held accountable," she said at one point, looking directly at the jury. "Two good people are dead because of my actions. A little boy has lost his parents. I live with that knowledge every day, and I will for the rest of my life. But I was not in my right mind. The woman who committed those acts was shattered by what had been done to her." As Elizabeth stepped down from the witness stand, Cooper noticed several jurors wiping tears from their eyes. The case had transcended ordinary criminal proceedings, touching on primal fears and fundamental questions of identity, family, and the abuse of power. The following day, after closing arguments that stretched for hours, the jury retired to deliberate. They remained sequestered for 3 days, eventually returning with their verdict: not guilty of first-degree murder by reason of temporary insanity, but guilty of 2 counts of manslaughter. The judge sentenced Elizabeth to 10 years in a psychiatric institution, with the possibility of transfer to a minimum security facility after successful treatment. The sentence was far less than the prosecution had sought, yet more than many in Millfield believed appropriate given the circumstances. As Elizabeth was led from the courtroom for the final time, her eyes met Cooper's briefly. In that moment he saw something like gratitude in her gaze, not for any leniency, but for the simple act of bringing truth to light after generations of secrets. 5 years passed. Cooper remained with the Millfield Police Department, promoted to chief after Wallace's retirement in 1936. The Harmon case had transformed the town, forcing a reckoning with its history and the influential family that had shaped it for generations. The mansion on Blackwood Hill stood empty now, its contents cataloged and much of the estate liquidated to pay restitution to the victims identified in William's journals. The 7 children fathered by William as part of his eugenics program had been located and their guardians informed of their true parentage, though most chose to maintain the lives they had known rather than embrace their connection to the disgraced Harmon name. On a crisp autumn day in 1939, Cooper received a letter from the Vermont State Psychiatric Hospital, where Elizabeth had been transferred after 3 years of treatment at a more restrictive facility. Dr. Marion Whitfield, who had continued to oversee Elizabeth's case, requested a meeting regarding a matter of significant importance to the ongoing resolution of the Harmon situation. Cooper made the journey north the following week, the familiar weight of the case settling over him as he drove. The psychiatric hospital was a modern facility set on spacious grounds, nothing like the forbidding asylums of previous decades. Dr. Whitfield met him in her office, offering coffee before addressing the purpose of his visit. Elizabeth has made remarkable progress, the psychiatrist began. She's confronted her trauma, accepted responsibility for her actions, and developed healthy coping mechanisms. The dissociative episodes have ceased entirely, and she's become something of a mentor to newer patients. Cooper nodded, unsurprised. Elizabeth's intelligence and resilience had been evident even during her darkest moments. I'm glad to hear it, but I assume you didn't ask me to drive 3 hours for a progress report? No, Whitfield acknowledged. I asked you here because Elizabeth has requested a supervised meeting with her son. William Jr. would be 10 now, still in the custody of the Caldwell grandparents. Elizabeth has had no contact with him since the trial, respecting the court's restrictions and the family's wishes. But she's reached a point in her recovery where facing this aspect of her past is important. Cooper frowned. That's not my decision to make. The Caldwells have legal custody, I understand. But they respect you, Detective Chief Cooper now, I should say. They know you fought for justice for their daughter and son-in-law. If you were to approach them with this request, explain Elizabeth's progress and the controlled nature of the proposed meeting. You want me to advocate for her? Cooper said flatly. Whitfield sighed. I want what's best for everyone involved. Elizabeth has 5 more years here minimum. She's not asking for custody or regular visitation, just one meeting, with me present to apologize to the boy and perhaps answer any questions he might have about his biological origins. Does the boy even know? About Elizabeth? About the circumstances of his birth? The Caldwells have been forthright with him in age-appropriate ways. Children are remarkably adaptable, Chief Cooper. William Jr. is doing well in school, has friends, participates in sports, but he does have natural questions about his identity and history that only Elizabeth can answer. Cooper considered the request. I'll speak with the Caldwells. That's all I can promise. Before leaving the hospital, Cooper met briefly with Elizabeth. She was thinner than he remembered, her dark hair now streaked with premature gray, but her eyes were clear and focused. Thank you for coming, she said, gesturing for him to sit in the small visitors' area of the common room. Dr. Whitfield told me she was contacting you. You look well, Cooper offered, suddenly uncomfortable in the presence of this woman whose darkest moments he had witnessed. I am well, Elizabeth replied with a small smile, as well as one can be given everything. I've had a lot of time to think, to understand the patterns that shaped my family for generations. She folded her hands in her lap. My father wasn't born a monster, you know. He was made one by his father and his father before him. The Harmon obsession with bloodlines and control didn't originate with William. Cooper nodded. Their investigation had uncovered evidence of similar manipulations dating back to the Civil War era. Quote, though none as extreme as William's experiments. About your son, he began. I know it's a lot to ask, Elizabeth interrupted, and I'll understand if the Caldwells refuse, but I need him to know that what happened wasn't his fault, that he's not tainted by his origins or by what I did. Her composure faltered slightly. He deserves to know that he's loved, despite everything. Cooper made the journey to Vermont a week later, meeting with the Caldwell grandparents in their modest farmhouse outside Burlington. Martha and Joseph. Caldwell were kind but cautious people who had rebuilt their lives around their grandson's needs following their daughter's murder. William Jr. now called simply Will by his family, was at school during Cooper's visit, a deliberate choice to allow the adults to speak freely. We've told him what we felt he could handle, Martha explained as they sat in the sunny kitchen. That Elizabeth is his biological mother, that she became very ill after learning that Will had been kept from her, that she hurt people and is now in a hospital getting help. He knows about the unusual circumstances of his conception, Cooper asked carefully. Joseph shook his head, not the full details, just that his biological father was also Elizabeth's father, and that it happened without her knowledge or consent. We felt that was enough for now. He'll learn the rest when he's older, if he wants to. Cooper explained Elizabeth's request, emphasizing the controlled nature of the proposed meeting and Dr. Whitfield's professional opinion that it could be beneficial for both Elizabeth and Will. The Caldwells listened without interruption, their expressions guarded. When Cooper finished, Martha spoke first. "We've always tried to do what's best for Will, even when it's difficult. And we believe in forgiveness. We have to keep going after what happened to Caroline and Thomas." She exchanged a look with her husband. "We'll need to talk to Will's therapist and to Will himself. This has to be his choice, not ours." 2 months later, on a snowy December morning, Cooper found himself back at the Vermont State Psychiatric Hospital, this time accompanying 10-year-old Will Caldwell and his grandparents. The boy was solemn and quiet, with the distinctive Harmon features softened by youth and the influence of the Caldwell genes. Dr. Whitfield had arranged for the meeting to take place in a comfortable room used for family therapy, with toys and art supplies available should Will need an outlet for his emotions. Elizabeth was already seated when they entered, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Cooper noticed she wore no makeup, her gray-streaked hair pulled back, simply presenting herself honestly without artifice. The initial moments were awkward, filled with tentative greetings and careful politeness. But as Will gradually relaxed, asking questions about Elizabeth's childhood and life before the bad things happened, a fragile connection began to form. Elizabeth answered each question thoughtfully, never evading the difficult truths but framing them in ways the boy could understand. "Were you always sad?" Will asked at one point, surprising the adults with his perception. Elizabeth considered the question. "Not always. I had happy moments riding horses on the estate, summers at the lighthouse, books that took me to different worlds. But there was always something missing that I couldn't name." She smiled gently. "A hole in my heart, that was you." Will absorbed this, then asked the question that clearly weighed most heavily on him. "Why did you hurt my mom and dad?" Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "So I was very, very sick in my mind. Learning what had happened to me, to us, broke something inside me. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was so focused on finding you that I couldn't see how wrong my actions were." She leaned forward slightly. "But Will, I want you to know that not a day goes by that I don't regret what I did. Your parents, Caroline and Thomas, they loved you and took care of you. They were your real parents in all the ways that matter." The boy nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer. The meeting continued for nearly an hour, ending when Will began to show signs of emotional fatigue. As the Caldwells prepared to leave, Elizabeth handed Will a small package. "This was mine when I was your age," she explained. "I thought you might like to have it." Will opened the package to reveal a small, intricately carved wooden box with a secret compartment, a Harmon family heirloom. "Thank you," he said politely, examining the craftsmanship with interest. Elizabeth made no move to touch him, respecting the boundaries that had been established. "Thank you for coming today. Will, it means more than I can say." As Cooper escorted the Caldwells out, Martha touched his arm. "She's different than I expected," she admitted quietly. "More human." "She is human," Cooper replied. "Flawed and damaged, but human." October 1944. The war in Europe had entered its final, desperate phase, and America had changed in ways few could have imagined a decade earlier. Cooper, now 53, and considering retirement, sat on the porch of his modest home on the outskirts of Millfield, reading a letter that had arrived that morning. The Harmon case had never truly closed for him, though its most dramatic chapters had concluded years ago. Elizabeth had been released from the psychiatric hospital in 1942, having served her full sentence with exemplary behavior. She had not returned to Millfield, but had settled in a small coastal town in Maine, living quietly on the modest income from what remained of her trust fund after restitution payments. The letter in Cooper's hands was from Elizabeth, her elegant handwriting unchanged despite the years. "Dear Chief Cooper," she had written, "I hope this letter finds you well. I've hesitated to contact you, knowing the pain and chaos the Harmon name brought to Millfield and to your life, but recent events have compelled me to reach out. Will has been visiting me during his school holidays for the past 2 years with the Caldwells' blessing. He's 15 now, asking more questions about his heritage and the Harmon history. I've been as honest as I can be, but there are gaps in my knowledge that only your investigation might fill. Would you consider meeting with us? Will has expressed a desire to understand the full scope of what happened, and I believe he's mature enough now to handle the truth. The Caldwells have given their permission. Should you agree? I know this is a significant request, and I would understand your refusal, but I believe that bringing light to the remaining shadows might help Will come to terms with his complex identity as he approaches adulthood. With respect and gratitude, Elizabeth Harmon, Cooper folded the letter, considering its implications. The Harmon case had been the most significant of his career, exposing decades of manipulation and abuse by one of Connecticut's most prominent families. The investigation had ultimately identified 12 children born as part of William's eugenics program. Stretching back to 1899, some had never learned the truth about their parentage. Others had chosen to distance themselves completely from the Harmon name and its legacy. After mulling it over for several days, Cooper wrote back agreeing to the meeting. A month later, he found himself driving north to the small Maine cottage Elizabeth now called home. It was a far cry from the Harmon mansion, a simple two-bedroom structure overlooking the Atlantic, with weathered shingles and a small garden that showed signs of careful tending. Elizabeth greeted him at the door, the years having softened her features but not diminished the intelligence in her eyes. Will stood beside her, now a lanky teenager with the characteristic Harmon height and bearing. "Chief Cooper," Elizabeth said warmly. "Thank you for coming all this way." "Just Cooper now," he corrected with a slight smile. "I retired last spring." They settled in the cottage's small living room where Elizabeth had prepared tea and sandwiches. Cooper noticed photographs on the mantel at various ages, the Caldwells, and one faded image of the Harmon mansion in its heyday. "I've been telling Will about our family history," Elizabeth explained after initial pleasantries had been exchanged. "It's the parts I know, at least. But your investigation uncovered much more than I ever knew." Cooper nodded, turning to Will. "What would you like to know?" The young man really considered the question carefully. "I want to understand why. Not just what my grandfather did, but why he did it. What made him think he had the right to play God with people's lives?" It was a profound question, one Cooper had pondered for years. "Your grandfather was a product of his time and his upbringing," he began. "The late 1800s saw the rise of eugenics, the idea that humanity could be improved through selective breeding. It was taught in universities, advocated by respected scientists. The Harmons, with their wealth and isolation, took these ideas to an extreme." Cooper spent the afternoon sharing what he had learned about the Harmon family's twisted history, carefully omitting the most disturbing details while providing enough context for Will to understand the scope of William's actions. He explained how each generation of Harmon men had become increasingly obsessed with bloodlines and control, culminating in William's elaborate program. "Your grandfather believed he was creating a superior human lineage," Cooper concluded. "He saw himself as a visionary, not a criminal. That kind of arrogance, combined with unlimited resources and a position of unquestioned authority, created the perfect conditions for abuse of power." Will listened intently, occasionally asking incisive questions that revealed his intelligence and emotional maturity. As the afternoon waned, he asked the question Cooper had been expecting: "Are there others like me? Other children from his experiments?" Cooper glanced at Elizabeth, who nodded slightly. "Yes," he answered. "Our investigation identified 12 in total, spanning over 40 years. You're the youngest. Have you told them about their real parentage?" "Those we could locate, yes. Some were already deceased. Others chose not to acknowledge the connection." Cooper hesitated. "It's a lot to process, learning something like that about yourself." Will nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like to meet them someday. Not now, but when I'm older. They're the only family I have, in a way. Besides grandmother and grandfather Caldwell and ... double quotes," he glanced at Elizabeth. "My mother." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears at the word the first time. Cooper suspected that Will had referred to her as his mother. As the visit concluded, Cooper found himself standing with Elizabeth on the small porch while Will explored the beach below. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. For bringing the truth to light all those years ago, and for coming here today." She gazed out at the ocean. "I've spent my life trying to understand how a family could become so twisted, how each generation could perpetuate and worsen the damage. I still don't have all the answers. Some things defy complete understanding," Cooper replied. "But Will seems to be breaking the cycle. He's a remarkable young man." Elizabeth smiled, pride evident in her expression. "The Caldwells deserve the credit. They've raised him with love and honesty, despite everything." "You've played a part too," Cooper observed. "You could have hidden from the past, changed your name, disappeared. Instead, you've faced it head-on and helped Will do the same." They watched as Will collected shells along the shoreline, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. In him, Cooper could see echoes of the Harmon lineage, the distinctive features, the quiet intelligence. But there was something else too, something that had been missing in generations of Harmon men: compassion, humility, a genuine connection to others. "The Harmon bloodline doesn't end with Will," Elizabeth said, seeming to read Cooper's thoughts. "But the curse might. That has to count for something." Cooper nodded, understanding the weight of her words. The twisted family line that had produced so much suffering had also, perhaps inadvertently, created the person who might finally heal its legacy. Will Caldwell Harmon, born of manipulation and violation, raised in the aftermath of tragedy, was forging his own path, one that honored truth while refusing to be defined by the darkness of the past. As Cooper drove home the following day, he reflected on the strange journey that had begun 11 years earlier with a telephone call from Elizabeth Harmon. The case had exposed the darkest aspects of wealth and privilege, the dangers of unchecked power, and the devastating consequences of treating human beings as specimens rather than people. But it had also revealed the capacity for growth and redemption, the possibility of breaking destructive patterns that had persisted for generations. In Will and in Elizabeth's painful journey toward acceptance and atonement, Cooper found a measure of hope that even the most twisted family lines could eventually straighten, reaching toward light instead of darkness.